Morning to everybody. Good morning to everybody. We are having folks enter into the room, and so we're going to give everyone a bit of time to settle in. We have quite a lot of interest, as one can expect for a report like this. So as our participants arrive, we will just give them a minute to get into the room, and then we will kick off our conversation about our new report. Really welcome, really delighted that folks can join us wherever you are this morning, this afternoon, this evening. I see folks still entering into the room, which is great, great news to be in conversation with so many interested parties. All right, so as a few folks continue to enter into the room, we've got quite a few participants to join our conversation today, and so I'm really thankful that people are able to join us. I'll say good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those joining from all around the world. My name is Nicole Bivens-Sadaka. I'm the Executive Vice President of Freedom House. Thank you for joining us for the launch of this new, great and exciting report, which is entitled Beijing's Global Media Influence. It's a brand new report on the Chinese Communist Party's increasingly sophisticated and coercive efforts to shape media narratives and to suppress independent journalism around the world. For those of you who don't know Freedom House, we are the longest operating international pro-democracy organization in the United States. And since 1941, we have been directly supporting human rights and democracy defenders around the world. We've been advocating for policy change to advance freedom and conducting rigorous research like what we will hear today on the challenges and opportunities for democracy around the world. And our mission today is as important as it has ever been. Before we dive in, I would really like to take a moment to express our sincere appreciation to those who have made this report and much of our work possible. So for those who have supported the Beijing's Global Media Influence, let me thank the U.S. Department of State, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the Hereford Foundation for your generous support of Freedom House's cutting-edge research. We could not do it without your support. Also, thanks to the Arch Puddington Fund for Combating Authoritarianism, which was established by generous donors in honor of Arch Puddington, who is our senior emeritus scholar and a person who has contributed so much to this field. This fund helps us carry forward his decades-long commitment to the cause of freedom and democracy. So now, without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Freedom House's Research Director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, Sarah Cook, who will walk us through the report's findings, including what democratic governments are doing and what they should be doing to oppose Beijing's growing media footprint. Sarah, over to you, and thank you for your work.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you everyone for joining us. We have a slideshow, so Catherine, do you want to put that up? Great, and I'm just going to turn off my video while we go through the slideshow. But I do want to actually, before I dive in, just say a big thanks to everyone who was involved in this project. It was really a huge team effort. My colleagues on the China research team and the co-authors of this report, Anjali Da, Ellie Young, and BC Han, have worked tremendously hard. But we also had over 40 analysts, advisors, reviewers, translators, and other Freedom House colleagues. And so what I'll be sharing today is really the result of everyone's research, insight, and wisdom. So to begin, the starting point for any discussion of Beijing's global media influence actually begins within China, where we see the Chinese Communist Party exerting tight political and social control. And this has been the case for many years, but over the past decade, repression has intensified in China against a widening set of targets. This change has also been reflected in the regime's more aggressive activities abroad. And so now the world is facing the unprecedented situation of the second largest economy being ruled by one of the globe's most authoritarian regimes. It's in this context that we embarked on the Beijing's Global Media Influence Project, the most comprehensive assessment to date, examining actions taken by Chinese officials to influence news and information flows abroad, as well as the democratic response in 30 countries around the world. Next slide. So what did we find? As Nicole, I think, hinted at, the Chinese Communist Party is certainly accelerating a multi-billion-dollar global campaign to shape public opinion and to secure both its hold on power in China and its policy priorities abroad. Chinese diplomats and state media are working to offset damage that's been done to the Chinese Communist Party's international reputation, actually because of its own policies in regions like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea, as well as the initial cover-up related to COVID-19 in Wuhan. And as this campaign is progressing, we're seeing these media influence efforts becoming more sophisticated, covert, and coercive. But there's also good news. Local journalists, civil societies, and some governments are pushing back. We also found that underlying media regulations in democratic societies are helping to fend off certain negative impacts of these efforts. Still, resilience is uneven. Only half of the countries assessed were found to be resilient and the other half vulnerable. Vulnerabilities were also found in all of the countries, even those with strong responses. And as I go through the presentation, I'll dive into a bit more detail on each of these findings. Next slide. So how did we conduct this research? The focus of the research is on the coverage period of 2019 to 2021, and we looked at 30 countries across 6 regions, all of which are designated free or partly free in freedom in the world, so the more democratic end of the spectrum. The report includes, in addition to the global essay, 30 in-depth country case studies that are based particularly on the research of local analysts in these 30 countries. And I would really encourage you to look at the website to take a look at some of these. The level of depth and nuance in each of these country case studies is really fascinating. In addition to the country case studies, we created a new index methodology with 150 questions. And what we did for the scoring of each country is we created 2 scores. One, to reflect the scope and scale of Beijing's media influence efforts targeting that country, and the other to assess the strength of the local response and level of resilience. It's through a comparison of those 2 factors, how the local level of resilience matches up against the influence efforts that a country is facing, that countries were assigned a status of resilient or vulnerable. Next slide. Catherine, I think the slides went off.
Yes.
I'll continue, but so just to talk a little bit about, there you go, what we mean by Beijing's global media influence. And I think a lot of people understandably, first of all, think about the propaganda dimensions, because we really see that everywhere in traditional media, on social media. That's really just a small part of what's going on. The campaigns range far beyond simple propaganda. They include disinformation, censorship and intimidation of local journalists, control over content distribution infrastructure, and trainings for media workers and officials. It's through these tactics that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to promote preferred narratives about China, about its own regime, about local investments, or other foreign policy priorities. But at the same time, to also marginalize or suppress news, political commentary, or investigative journalism that presents the Chinese government and its leaders in a negative light. When we look at the tactics like trainings and infrastructure, there's also the dimension of building up avenues for control and influence looking ahead to the future. Next slide. So as I mentioned, this campaign is expanding, and this really came out in the country-specific data that we were looking at. 18 of the 30 countries faced intensified influence efforts over the period of 2019 to 2021. A number of those that didn't were actually ones where there had already been an uptick during a previous period, and there was kind of just a steady continuation of influence mechanisms that had been put in place earlier. 16 out of the 30 countries faced a high level or a very high level of Chinese Communist Party influence efforts in their media. And only 4 faced low efforts. Taiwan, the United States, and the United Kingdom experienced the most intense influence efforts. And perhaps that's not surprising given what many of us have probably read in the news. But when you look a little bit further down to those orange bars, It's actually, you see really the global dimensions of what's happening, because strong campaigns were also documented in Nigeria, Spain, Kenya, the Philippines, and Argentina. But even in those countries that are yellow, the ones with relatively low scores like Ghana, Israel, and Tunisia, core dimensions of the media influence toolbox were still present. State media content inserts, censorship pressures from Chinese diplomats, and an infrastructural presence for China-based companies with close CCP ties. Next slide, please. Now, it's not just the overall scope and scale and intensity of the campaign, but there's certainly also an evolution in the tactics being applied. And these are three of the main trends I'll go into detail on. There's actually an essay on the website dedicated to each one of these for those who would like a little bit more detail. The first is the increased presence of Beijing-backed content in mainstream media. And as someone who's been following this space for over a decade, this really struck me. In country after country, it was one, often more than one, mainstream news outlet that was republishing content that had been contributed by the Chinese embassy or by a Chinese state media outlet that is under the tight control of the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda department. In some countries, there were also co-productions, so partnerships with local media to create content, but still that editorial influence is there. And we found examples of this in over 130 outlets in the 30 countries we examined, not only in print publications, but also in television and on the radio. That isn't accidental. In 16 of the countries, there are new or upgraded agreements. So you see that trajectory. And the issue is that, it's not necessarily a problem that the Chinese government, there are paid editorials that all kinds of entities do. But in many cases, the state-linked origins of the content aren't clearly labeled. And in some cases, it's deliberately obscured. So that's where you start to see some of these more covert dimensions of what's going on. We also found covert tactics or disinformation campaigns on social media. I think the starting point when we talk about the social media presence is there is actually a lot of activity in many, many different languages by Chinese diplomats and state media entities. The image you see here is from the China Radio International Facebook page in Sinhala, which came up in our Sri Lanka report. And a lot of it, is kind of soft diplomacy, it's pandas and bullet trains and, maybe sometimes more staid political content of Xi Jinping's latest speech. But there also is more problematic elements to what's happening. In all of the countries studied, Chinese diplomats or state media outlets openly promoted falsehoods or misleading contents. These included conspiracy theories about the origins of COVID-19, demonization of pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, and whitewashing or denial of human rights atrocities in Xinjiang. And as I mentioned, we also saw manipulation using fake accounts or other unaffiliated accounts where the link to the Communist Party wasn't clear. In half of the countries, armies of fake accounts were found to be artificially amplifying and boosting posts from Chinese diplomats, including in the United States, United Kingdom, India, and South Africa. And in 9 countries, there was at least one targeted disinformation campaign that used fake social media accounts to spread falsehoods or sow confusion. In the United States, Taiwan, and the Philippines, this wasn't only regarding China, but also domestic politics. So that's where you see, again, this element of kind of the more covert and manipulative tactics. Now turning to the coercive ones. Next slide, please. We've also seen a rise in coercive tactics and various forms of intimidation and censorship efforts. And I realize this graphic has a lot of detail, but it just gives you a sense of kind of the global dimension of what's happening. In 24 countries, one or another of these tactics were found. In over half of the countries, Chinese diplomats and other government representatives took actions to intimidate, harass, or pressure journalists or commentators in response to their coverage. In a smaller subset of countries, we've seen an increase in cyberbullying by pro-CCP trolls since 2019. But one of the things that really stood out was that it isn't just Chinese government officials. The Hong Kong authorities and companies with close CCP ties like Huawei have also joined the fray, particularly when it comes to legal threats related to the national security law or defamation suits, as we saw in countries like Israel and France. And notably, as you can see here, in 17 countries, local officials or media executives outside China have themselves attempted to suppress critical reporting, either because they got a phone call from the Chinese embassy or because they were taking efforts to protect some other economic or political interest that they wanted, that would have been upset by a particular form of reporting in the local media. Next slide. But one of the most inspiring and I think fascinating aspects of this project was really looking at the pushback and the democratic resilience. And it really is global. We found examples of at least one form of active pushback in all 30 countries, and clear examples of the impact of media influence campaigns being blunted because of these actions. I think just a few examples to think about in this context. One, in 28 countries, there was reporting on the CCP's actual political or media influence in the local environment, or say an expose of a disinformation campaign. And that form of reporting was particularly effective at raising awareness and galvanizing public and policy responses that end up mitigating the effects of that very type of influence. The other thing that stood out and just wasn't happening a few years ago was that in 10 countries, local media outlets were discontinuing news partnership agreements with Chinese state news agencies. So even while some are growing, others are being discontinued. And as you can see in the photo here, the presence in some countries at least of an exile or dissident community, be they Chinese democracy activists, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, or people who practice Falun Gong, have played an important role in raising public awareness, both about what their counterparts face in China, but also some of the ways in which they're encountering repression or censorship in their current home country. Beyond the active pushback, certain types of laws present in many democracies form a vital dimension of resilience. These include freedom of information laws, media ownership transparency laws, or investment screening mechanisms. And we found numerous examples of those being activated to enhance transparency or accountability surrounding influence activities from CCP-linked entities. Next slide. And this just gives you a taste of really how global this is. It's not, the pushback isn't just happening in places like the US or Taiwan or Australia. We found examples in newsrooms in Kenya, Peru, and the Philippines, in parliaments in Italy and Kuwait, and in journalistic training programs in Tunisia, South Africa, and Nigeria. And that's also something that just wasn't happening a few years ago. It's a real shift in the awareness and response in so many places around the world. Next slide. But there are still vulnerabilities. And in all 30 countries, even the ones that rank the strongest in terms of their local response and resilience, there was at least one vulnerability. Some of these involve gaps in the types of regulations I was just speaking about, related to cross ownership or transparency or defamation protections. But in many countries, the government response is lagging. Media and civil society have really been at the forefront of the pushback, and it's only a small subset of governments that are actively monitoring this space and attempting a coordinated response. As you saw in the censorship slide, more common is that local governments or other members of the elite have been aiding censorship or suppressing coverage. And in 19 countries, there were increased domestic attacks on the media more broadly, unrelated to China, since 2019. But even that fact itself reduces the broader resilience to a form of authoritarian foreign influence by those media and civil society activists who are at the forefront of the pushback. We also looked at a certain form of pushback we called problematic pushback. And that's a situation where political leaders use legitimate concerns about CCP influence to justify arbitrary restrictions like blanket blocks on China-based social media apps, or to target outlets that are critical of their government under the excuse of some kind of trying to limit negative influence from China, or using racist language that fuels xenophobic sentiment against members of the local Chinese community. And that came up in 14 countries. Next slide. So what's the impact of all of this? How does it play out? The answer to that question is mixed, and maybe that reflects these different dynamics that I was just speaking about. On the one hand, in 23 out of the 30 countries, public opinion is actually less favorable to China and the Chinese government since 2018, despite this massive investment. And as many of you have probably seen for yourself, on a daily basis in media outlets around the world, we see news coverage critical of the Chinese government, or exposing activities and abuses that the CCP would likely prefer to be hidden. But Beijing has made some gains. First, the Chinese language media sector is still very much dominated in many countries by pro-Beijing or Beijing-linked outlets. Second, the intersection between broader forms of political influence and the impact on the media was evident in a lot of places, where you see this co-optation of local elites translating into assistance with Beijing's propaganda and censorship efforts. And it's perhaps in that context that even though we see a lot of critical reporting, we did also find examples of self-censorship. And in 16 countries, local journalists or commentators reported self-censoring or having to be careful about what they said. Looking to the future, there have been real gains in the control over content distribution infrastructure by companies with close CCP ties. And it's not just that they're based in China, it's that they have executives who are members of the party or there are local party branches. There are very clear ties to the party itself. So to conclude, the economic, cultural, and technological contributions that China, its companies, and its people have to offer provide real benefits to people and countries around the world. But even as these ties grow, it's so important to be open-eyed about the regime that rules China and to put in place safeguards against actions that violate democratic norms and local laws, and to do so in a way that itself respects human rights. Anyone engaged in the media space should acknowledge the influence exerted by China's authoritarian regime on the news and information circulating in global publications and social media feeds. They also need to be prepared for how they're going to respond when pressure to adjust content in Beijing's favor inevitably emerges. The report includes detailed recommendations for media, policymakers, and others, outlining concrete steps that can be taken to enhance transparency, to ensure diversity of coverage, and to shore up the vulnerabilities we identify. And many of the examples in the recommendation are actually based on something that we saw in a positive way happening in one of the countries under study. The good news is that the momentum is on democracy's side in the way that it wasn't 5 years ago. But as you saw from this presentation, the Chinese government is clearly adapting and expending significant human and financial resources to achieve its goals. So what it really comes down to are individual choices of those in the media, government, civil society, and tech sectors in each and every country to determine whether in the coming years, Beijing gains more influence or whether press freedom and fact-based reporting win out. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was an extraordinary overview of what is clearly a very comprehensive and well-researched and deep analytical report. Thank you so much for your work and leadership on this and that of your entire team, because I know there were many people who contributed to this. It's a lot for all of us to digest, which is why I'm also pleased to welcome several panelists to help us unpack all of these excellent findings. I'll start our time together now by asking a few questions of our expert panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions from those of you who are attending. We have hundreds and hundreds of people who are attending, and so I'm really hoping that we can get some great questions. I encourage those of you who are attending this our talk today to just submit questions through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And once we go through our panel discussion, I'll turn to some of those questions and get through as many of those as possible. So first, allow me to introduce our panelists. Dr. Cliff Mboya is an Africa-China analyst. He holds a PhD from Fudan University in China, and his research interests include Africa-China relations, global governance, and development communication. He recently authored a book chapter on the impact of Beijing's Maritime Silk Road on Eastern Africa. William Yang is the East Asia correspondent for Deutsche Welle and president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Taiwan. His work has been published in BuzzFeed News, The Guardian, The Irish Times, and The Independent. We're also joined by Dr. Andrew Nathan. He's a professor of political science at Columbia University. Off campus, he is also a member and former chair of the Board of Human Rights in China, a member of the Advisory Committee on Human Rights for Human Rights Watch Asia, and a former member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, and we're delighted to say also of Freedom House. So we're thankful to his service for many in this community. William, let me start with you. You're the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of China. Can you share some of your observations and experience of how Beijing's influence efforts are playing out there? And especially, I'll say, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And maybe if you could comment both on Taiwan, but also in the region more broadly.
Yeah, so I think Taiwan is really at the forefront for China to really test the many different methods and many different ways that they are trying to create a division in society through disinformation because of, I think, the shared language, and also simply because of Beijing's political goal to try to have an easier way for them to convince, create chaos in the Taiwanese society. And I think since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen a lot more emergence of disinformation that is related to the Chinese military activities, or sometimes like it's trying to discredit the democratic government here. And there will be different kinds of content that are trying to claim that the Taiwanese military, trying to paint Taiwan's military in a bad light. And since the visit of the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi from last month, we are, during the visit and even post-visit, we're seeing a lot of, I think, intimidating or like fear-mongering type of content that are suggesting that the Chinese military are positioning themselves along the border and trying to really like launch a possible invasion against Taiwan, when they're also actually staging exercises all around surrounding Taiwan. So I think these there are many different, I think, factors that are behind a lot of these disinformation. Sometimes it's not necessarily directly related to the government, but oftentimes these messages could easily start spreading within Taiwan's civil society on messaging apps, especially in like messaging apps that you can create closed off groups among your own friends or your close circles. So like, I think if we come down to the ultimate goal of all of this, it's pretty clear that the goal is to create division and create distrust in the democratic system, and at the same time trying to create, like, I think, loopholes for China to insert itself to deepen their operation, especially like, I think, mixing up the real information against the false information in Taiwan's public, and create confusion about the perceptions of the actual situation across the Taiwan Strait. But there are, like, I think the report has already shown, there have been a lot of different efforts in Taiwan's civil society to try to respond to that. I can add a little bit more later, but I think overall, we are seeing concerted methods and the large amount of disinformation coming from different channels targeting the Taiwanese public.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for that overview, William. Very, very helpful. Cliff, let me turn to you. How would you describe the most impactful or meaningful ways in which Beijing's media influence is manifesting in the African context? What changes have you observed over the past, say, 3 to 5 years? And I'll encourage you to turn your mic on. Thank you.
Yeah, so we know that Chinese media went global a few years back, and this was not just limited to the continent, but in the African context. I think what is most visible right now and the most impactful is the reach, those in the media space. When it comes to reach, it relates to the amount of people you're able to reach with the narratives or the information that you want to pass out. And I think this has been the greatest impact coming from Beijing media influence, because the media, the Chinese media houses didn't have maybe the intended results, because they didn't get enough audiences because of the kind of content they were producing. And in a country like Kenya, where there are very strict safeguards and people are very keen on the kind of information they get because of the relationship with the media, I think it was pointed out very early that you should be very careful with the information that you get from this kind of media. So I think with that, they had to adapt to a different strategy. And what we've seen lately is they've tried other avenues to reach as many people as possible. And see, the most visible include, content sharing, donating things like equipments to maybe the national broadcaster, just to make it possible to sign deals with the media houses and maybe even individual Chinese companies, because they also advertise there and they share the same information. So I think for me, the most visible is in terms of reach. And then also related to that, you see that it offers also a platform for the state actors actually to convey the kind of narratives, pro-Beijing narratives, because previously most of the reporting on China was often negative. And you see, one of the strategies was to try and change that kind of reporting. So you see this giving them platforms to counter negative messages about China and Beijing. So with these platforms, you see that there's kind of a dual messaging. You say this and they say, okay, that is a lie, this is our position. And the challenge with that, it leaves people who are not able to go beyond what they see on TV or in these platforms. Then it leaves them confused because they don't really get to understand who's saying the truth and who's lying. So those are some of the impacts that we have. And then also an interesting part, and this is a point that I just grasped yesterday. We're just coming out of an election. We have a new president. He's not been signed in yet. And he was interviewed by CNN yesterday by Christian Amanpro, and he was asked the same question about food security and the role of Russia and Ukraine. And before that, we used to have, we used to see ourselves as democratic. We used to align with these democratic values, things to do with human rights and that. But over time, we are beginning to take a neutral stance, and it's not necessarily neutral. It's just because now we see that we have maybe an alternative in China. People tend to look at it from a positive side, that now we have a voice, we have alternatives, that is giving us a voice. But most times you find that it's mostly aligned to Beijing's narrative, because why would you be neutral? You either support what is happening or not. Neutrality sometimes doesn't reflect the truth or what is really on the ground. So it is quite interesting that you're beginning to take such positions, and these positions you'll see a lot of these neutral positions originating from the kind of narratives or content coming from Chinese media, because they talk of global solidarity, not taking sides, not pointing fingers, and this that leaves little room for looking at things objectively and dealing with the core issues. So I think those are the key issues that I've noticed. But then looking at the changes that I've noticed in the last few years, for me, the most prominent changes have been the shift from traditional media to digital platforms, including social media. And this has worked quite well for this kind of narratives. And to be honest, I think our media landscape is quite resilient, and because of that kind of trouble, just infiltrating that, then social media and digital platforms become an option, because these go directly to the people and to the audiences, and you have key people pushing these narratives. Then you're able to bypass those editorial checks, and the media house regulation and things like that. So you deal with people directly through the social media and other digital platforms. So I think those are key issues that we must begin to analyze going forward. So I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent. Thank you, Cliff. That was an extraordinary overview of just what this actually looks like in tangible ways in so many different countries. And I think an important takeaway as we're looking and digesting so much great research coming out of this report is both how this influence that Beijing is exerting is hitting other countries' democratic development as they are going through, not just in their media, but throughout. And you've illustrated that certainly in the case of Kenya. And then also how it is hitting press freedom and internet freedom. And those are issues which many democracies are undergoing challenges with, and how this tremendous influence is really hitting all of those pivot points at the same time. Andy, let me come to you, and then Sarah, I'll come back to you, because I think, Cliff's points about what's going on in Africa, I'd love for us to explore other regions as well. But let me go to Andy and just think about the topic and the findings of this report are focused on the media space. But the Chinese Communist Party exercises its influence abroad, obviously, in many other areas. How do you see these other different dimensions intersecting and evolving in the coming years?
Yeah, so I think attention to Chinese influence activities overseas started rather recently, about 5 years ago, when Anne-Marie Brady, who's a New Zealand-based scholar, published a paper on the website of the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. called Magic Weapons in 2017. And I would encourage anybody who hasn't read her report to go back and look at it. It's still very relevant. And then it was followed up by a lot of attention in Australia, where Chinese influence activities seem to have been particularly intense, with contributions to political candidates, with pressure through Chinese students in Australian universities, and of course, media. And there is a scholar there named Clive Hamilton, who wrote a book called Silent Invasion: China's Influence in Australia. And Hamilton followed up a few years later with a book co-authored with Marieka Olberg called Hidden Hand. And another Australia-based young scholar has just come out with a book called Spies and Lies, which focuses more down on influence activities by Chinese Ministry of State security agents. So there was a lot of attention in Australia to various dimensions of influence, definitely including media, but also looking at the political parties and academia. And then in the United States, a book came out a couple years ago, edited by Larry Diamond and Orville Schell, called China's Influence and American Interests, which again looked at media, but also academia, the business community, efforts to make friends in Congress with visits to China, things of that kind, and efforts to create influence on local governments, for example, with sister city arrangements and friendly visits that would be focused on feel-good exposures to China, together with business interests. Recently, I had helped to co-edit a book with Wu Jimin, whom William probably knows, of Taiwan, and Brian Fong, who was then in Hong Kong academia, called China's Influence and Center Periphery Tug of War. And that book, Taiwan and Hong Kong were sort of special. So again, absolutely yes, media, but also, and business, but also efforts to influence the public in these two societies through efforts to impact elections, through the use of economic influence, for example, in the case of Taiwan, turning up or off the spigot of tourism, which has been an important industry, mainland China tourism, an important industry in Taiwan, that when the government wanted to put pressure on Taiwan, they would ramp it down. And influence in Hong Kong on the film industry. There's also, we didn't cover this in the Larry Diamond and Orville Schell book, but a number of books have come out very recently on how Hollywood has, in search of the China market for their films, has censored their own films. And just now a book has come out called America Second by a guy named a journalist, Isaac Stone Fish, on how China has tried to influence American opinion through many channels, but especially these various institutes and consultancy firms that have an interest in business in China. So there is a lot of attention to Chinese influence activities outside in and beyond the media space. Sarah's report, I think, pushes forward a lot compared to the existing research, our understanding of the Chinese efforts in the media space. I see a sort of three interesting themes in all, I mean, there are many, but three interesting themes in all of this influence activity effort. One is that it's more about China feeling misunderstood and defamed and libeled and trying to polish up China's image. And Sarah's report, I think, supports this as I read it, than it is about what the Russians do, which is to try to sort of destabilize the democracies. It's more defensive than offensive in that sense. It's about, you know, you guys hate China. Why is that? And let us tell you how good we are, how good our system is. It does kind of shade over to the thing about our system is actually better than your system. But William just said that a lot of the influence effort in Taiwan is trying to destabilize the Taiwan democracy. That's not so much the case in other countries, as far as I know. It's more, as I say, kind of polishing China's own image. A second theme that I think is very important is that in the diasporic communities, the Chinese communities overseas in other countries, Xi Jinping says, all the sons and daughters and granddaughters and grandsons, the Yanhuang Zisun, the descendants of the Yellow Emperor, all ethnic Chinese should love the motherland and should therefore love the Chinese Communist Party and should support us. So Beijing is making an ethnic appeal. Doesn't matter, in their view, what your citizenship is. If you're an ethnic Chinese, you should support not just China, but the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping, which kind of puts a target on the backs of Chinese ethnic communities and intersects with our own, Americans' own, wrong policy of ethnic profiling of Chinese. It creates a kind of vicious circle in which China's claim of loyalty then intersects with our tendency, unfortunately, to ethnically profile and suspect Chinese when that's a problem sometimes, but not, of course, not always at all. Third point I would make is that it seems like Beijing, and Sarah's report brings this out quite well, that Beijing's effort is of course, succeeding to some extent in some places, but majorly speaking, is not paying off for the huge size of the investment. Beijing's soft power varies in different parts of the world, but is really going down in certainly in Europe, in the United States, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, and many important markets. Beijing's soft power is declining rather than increasing. Sarah had a slide on the Uyghur issue. It's a good example where the small, really, community of Uyghurs in exile has succeeded to a tremendous extent in turning that into a losing proposition for Beijing propaganda internationally. And we just had this report issued by the retiring UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that said that it's crimes against humanity and potentially genocide, big black eye in propaganda terms for China. So, but the Chinese side doesn't seem to think they're making a mistake. I mean, I've asked some of my Chinese friends, is there a feeling in China that the government is, failing to make its cases, perhaps overreaching, doing a bad job? And that doesn't seem to be the view in China. So I would anticipate the Chinese government to continue to invest in the propaganda strategies and other influence efforts that they have been making in recent years. And I guess It's all part of the bigger emerging strategic competition between China and the US and our allies. Thank you.
Fascinating, Andy. I think, and I really appreciate you elucidating those three trends or those three takeaways, because I think those are important as we're considering what is the impact and really what is also the motivation behind this. Let me turn and pull one of the points that you just made, Andy, and come back to all of the panelists. We'll do sort of another speed round before we turn to our questions from the audience. I'd love to dig a little bit deeper also on what are the key narratives that we see Chinese diplomats and state media pushing in different regions, but then also what, if any, impact are they having? The report talks about independent media, civil society, local governments have prevented Beijing from gaining traction in certain media environments. Cliff, would love to hear from you, and then we'll turn to William. What are some of those narratives, but what are some of the most inspiring and at least encouraging cases of this that you've seen in Kenya or in Africa more broadly? What do we learn from those?
Yeah, so I limit this to what I see in Kenya, and I'm sure it happens in several African countries. And, this report, this is lately, COVID has dominated China-Africa relations for a while. We're just coming of it, and now the Ukraine war has taken over. But for some time now, COVID diplomacy has dominated the narrative between China and Africa. So for me, the key narratives are related to good bilateral relations, China's political system, and COVID diplomacy, as I've mentioned. And, these ties are presented as maybe, they look at the historical links, win-win narrative, and currently there's been a pushback on the debt trap narrative that has also come to dominate China-Africa relations for some time now. So, China is actively touting a Pan-African response to the pandemic and other global challenges, just trying to bring this idea of solidarity with Africa when it comes to global challenges and diplomacy. And you could see that being heightened, particularly during the COVID diplomacy, and which evolved into a vaccine diplomacy, when there were concerns about vaccine apartheid in the West. China wanted to distinguish itself as standing in solidarity with Africa, distributing a lot of vaccines in the continent and things like that. So for the last, for the last year or two, I think that has dominated the narrative for some time now. But generally, I would say that the key narrative has been the Belt and Road Initiative for a very long time. I think for the last, we have the Forum on China-Africa Relations that comes in cycles. So the last cycle focused on the Belt and Road Initiatives and the project being done by China. So the narratives revolved around how China is helping African countries develop, achieve their development goals and things like that. So that was very mainstream. But then you see, after the last FOCAC, now the narrative has shifted to the digital realm, So we are now talking about the digital Silk Road. And if you look lately, since the last FOCAC forum in Senegal, then you see that now emphasis is on 5G rollout in the continent, e-governance, they're building data centers in Africa. Companies like Huawei that have been sanctioned in Western countries are focusing their investments on the continent. And I think this will impact even the media space and the digital space in a very major way. And I don't think we are well prepared for that, because if you look, for example, in the Kenyan report, you'll see the resilience is mostly limited to how our media and civil society have been able to work together so that to come to a level where they've established certain norms and ethics. And these are limited to professional journalism and maybe professional media houses. But then when it comes to social media, then there's still a lot of gap that is left there. So I think a lot more needs to be done in that space. And then when it comes to resilience and what we have managed to do just in terms of resilience and being able to push back against, I will say that, we have regulatory provisions from government, and some of them are initiatives from professional journalists, media houses and civil society who are concerned about media freedom. So with that, we see like it's a multi-stakeholder form of checks and balances, where you find a situation where, a media house, for example, publish that kind of propaganda material, and then you'll find this other global, they'll come and ask questions like, there's fact checking. We have organizations that are focused on fact checking. This could be civil society, like this media house says this, how true is this? So those kind of initiatives really help, and for Kenya, for example, you're very lucky because we have a legal provision that dictates that any media house, the content must be about 40 to about 60%. So those kind of provisions also limit how much foreign media organizations can influence a country, because with that, then you have to bring in some local elements, and it's not easy if you're totally foreign. So it means you have to collaborate with locals and trying to bring in local programming, and then it brings a conflict of interest, because now it becomes maybe Chinese and Kenyan interests. So it makes it a little bit difficult to influence a country to a large extent. And then the other key point for me is basically, it boils down to just the media ethics and amongst the journalists themselves. And I think a country like Kenya is very lucky because this has been emphasized on for a very long time. So I think they have established certain standards that it becomes very difficult to go back because of the same checks and balances. Then, it becomes problematic if you want to deviate. And a case in point is when our national broadcaster, the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, because initially when they started cooperating with China, because when Chinese state media came to Africa and how they engaged in diplomacy, it was mostly high level, and they engaged with the state rather than non-state actors. So obviously the first people they will approach will be the state agencies. So with that, they naturally went to the national broadcaster. So they donated equipment, they started content sharing with the national broadcaster. But then you'll see that immediately that happened, lawmakers, civil society, and even the audience were very concerned, like, so what does it mean for press freedom? How are we going to influence? And, in our own National Assembly, some members of parliament were concerned about issues to do with sovereignty and how that will impact how we report and things like that. So I think those are very interesting and very important aspects that have helped us rebuff that kind of influence. And that is at an institutional level, but then also at individual level. I think there's been a lot of media training and media awareness, both locally and abroad, just to make sure that the media environment is safe for journalists so that they can operate freely and report professionally. So from my own perspective, I think that has really helped in terms of resilience, because, individual journalists are also able to call each one out and question what they are doing. And there's an example that is also in the report when a journalist reported negatively about the SGR project in Nairobi. The Chinese actors came out really strongly to condemn him and to even threaten legal action. But you see, there was a lot of support for this particular journalist from the media houses, from the Kenyan Union of Journalists. We have the Editors Guild, so we have those kind of organizations that make sure that our media freedom and media standards are enhanced. And I think those are very key positive elements to look at. And these are also lessons and the initiatives that could be adopted in other countries, because it seems to be working in Kenya and it could work in other countries that are struggling with the media freedom.
Excellent,
Yeah, leave it at
excellent.
that.
Those are great examples. Yes, that are, I think, and what we really do need to do, to your last point, Cliff, is really take those successful examples and see how we can share those across regions, across countries, because I think we're seeing that resilience. I'm going to turn to some audience questions, but then pull our panelists into some of those different questions, because we've got really great ones coming in. One of the questions, and William, I'll go to you first, but Sarah, also, if you want to jump in on this. Does China manipulate international media on territorial disputes, such as disputes over the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the India-China border? And if yes, what does that look like? How do they do that?
Yeah, I think they are doing a lot of that, especially in the surrounding regions, especially the maritime areas where they seem to view it as China's territorial water. We see this already with South China Sea. It's a long-standing area where China really tries to insert their own narrative and their own way of like describing the status of the South China Sea in different kinds of media and through their own China Daily, CGTN, and Xinhua, all these English outlets, but also at the same time, their diplomats are continuing to push these lines at official press briefings. And at the same time, for the Taiwan Strait, this is another very, very most recent example, because they have started to ignore the fact that the Taiwan Strait is in international water. Their government officials and international media outlets have repeatedly come out and say that the Taiwan Strait is not in international water. It's part of China's territory. And so all these so-called freedom of navigation being conducted by different countries, navies are actually not what they're saying is the rights that these countries should enjoy under the international law. And that obviously is trying to counter the claims that are being presented mostly by the US Navy and the US government, because the United States is one of the countries that has the most active navigation in these areas. And I think this is clear examples about China's ambition of not only, I think it's referring to Dr. Nathan's point earlier, their, I think, goals of using these aggressive narrative, trying to change narrative, insert their own narrative, it's not only just to try to destabilize the regional, I think, situation, but rather it's to justify their own claims, and also at the same time trying to I think strengthen their actions to back up the activities that they have been doing in South China Sea and their troubling activities along the Indian-China border, and at the same time trying to, I think, provide more support in order to I think basically back up why they will not settle into any kind of negotiation. So I think there are a lot of political consideration behind these kind of narratives that they've been pushing in different parts of Asia. And we are seeing the intensified frequency with these kind of claims. Especially, I think Taiwan, the Taiwan situation right now is probably one of the most contested, and they are putting a lot of efforts into trying to change the narrative. And that, I think, is ultimately going to relate to what a lot of the military experts are saying about the so-called attempt to change the status quo across the Taiwan Strait.
Right. Thank you, William. It really does highlight how extraordinarily impactful all of this is on the security calculations, as well as economic calculations across the region. Sarah, can I just ask you if you want to jump in on that before I turn to Andy for another question that came in from the chat?
Sure. I mean, I think I would echo what William was saying about, what the Chinese media and the diplomats are saying. I think what really came out in countries like the Philippines or India also is just the backfiring effect. So, they can say and put out all they want about this is our territory, but then national media in the Philippines talking about how fishermen are being negatively affected by this just really galvanizes and informs public opinion. And so that's where their own actions in some of these territorial disputes end up undermining the narratives that they're making about win-win and things like that. And so one thing we saw in the Philippines too is that the national, and this was one of the really interesting kind of civil society pushback examples, was actually a set of ethical guidelines by a journalist association in the Philippines about how to report on China, and including in it some points about editorial independence, some points about guiding people to what are like good sources on this dispute, but actually also talking about things like avoiding racist language, for example. And I think it's those types of kind of ethical codes of how do you deal with these various aspects of influence that we're starting to see in more countries. And that was just one that really stood out as an interesting example.
That's a great example. Andy, let me turn to you with a question from our colleague Abu, who asks about what are countries, especially democratic countries, doing to counter propaganda. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on what governments should consider as to how they should tackle this issue, which they prioritize, what pitfalls should they avoid? What does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, so this is a tough one because I think it's only part of a huge problem of misinformation and fake information and alternative facts that we're flooded with from everywhere. So what can one do about that? So, I mean, I don't have an answer, but the answer that I see being promoted in general for this problem is something called media literacy, which is people are so, but I personally am not so optimistic about media literacy because, the dynamic of people getting into their, I myself am in my little rabbit hole of reading the New York Times and Freedom House publications, and I don't watch Fox News. I mean, so I think, except when it's made fun of on Stephen Colbert or something like that. So, yeah, but that's an answer that's out there. And I think another part of it is that governments, when government policies are at issue, when they're mischaracterized, the government has to answer. I don't know that our government is doing that well enough. Another thing that I really liked in Sarah's report was the emphasis on China expertise, which I think is strong in the United States and in the UK, France, Germany, but in many countries, there's not much China expertise. And so, for example, I think in Africa, Cliff would be a relatively unusual person who's a China expert in Africa. And I think that having more people who understand where the various Chinese arguments are kind of coming from, what their underlying structure is, what, how the United Front works, would be very helpful. But who's going to fund this expertise around the world? To that, I don't have an answer.
Sarah, let me thank you for that, Andy. Sarah, can I just ask also, obviously the report is not just presenting the facts and the figures, which are so impactful, but also giving some recommendation for governments as well as civil society and media. Can you just walk us through a few of those?
Sure. I mean, I think to Andy's point, one thing is for governments to figure out how they can support the civil society and the media in their own societies, and to work with civil society as they're trying to figure out kind of this multi-stakeholder response to some of these challenges. And that's one thing that we've seen in Taiwan that's been done really well by the government. And I think you really need both of those parts, because again, in democracies, there's only so much we want the government actually doing, right? But I think in terms of, especially from a regulatory perspective, putting in place regulations that require more transparency, for example, relating to some of these expenditures, relating to moderation policies of social media apps, including ones like TikTok. So rather than kind of going in the direction of censoring more, just trying to use the regulatory power of a government to enhance transparency and give information, because we really did see how in places that existed, it had such an impact, whether it was a civil society audit or investigation of what was being done in this or other space, or a legislation in the US, like we have the Foreign Agent Registration Act, that showed how much money China Daily was actually sending to local publications. And as soon as that was being enforced, like very quickly, several major outlets discontinued those inserts, and a PR firm stopped, helping the Chinese embassy. So I think just shedding light just gives people information, both, it just lets the public know and companies know that so people understand what's happening. And then the other thing I would say is just really looking ahead in this kind of interdepartmental coordination of kind of being like, this is actually an issue. And we do see that in a number of countries. France is a country that we're seeing a bit more of that. The US has several pretty nascent entities for that type of cross-agency coordination. But because this spans foreign policy and domestic policy and media regulation and investment screening of digital infrastructure, it's really hard for each of those departments to have the level of knowledge and expertise that's needed to navigate this. And so having institutions, and this may be just related to foreign influence generally, it may be, so it's the same entities that are dealing with Russia or Venezuela in certain parts of the world, that might address China. And I think it's those kinds of mechanisms that allow for longer term strategic planning and implementation of better safeguards that can become really important. So I'll just stop there. I think the transparency mechanisms, that kind of planning ahead. And then of course, for governments to not crack down on their own media. I mean, I think when you have governments themselves joining this effort, either undermining all of the things that Cliff was talking about resilience, or aiding the Chinese regime, is obviously stop doing that is important too.
Absolutely. And it is important how this influence does intersect with the challenges that many democracies are facing in that space as well. Let me go to a question from Luis Duarte, who does focuses his question really on a region which we haven't really touched upon, which is the Americas. Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela are really struggling, obviously, with tremendous repression at home. What can you say? And I guess this is probably a question for you, Sarah, but any of our experts obviously can jump in from their experience as well. What can you say about the media influence of China in those countries which are struggling with authoritarian governance?
So to be honest, we didn't look at those countries particularly because we were looking at the more democratic end of the spectrum. I think, and again, I haven't done the full methodology. We actually have on our website where you can look at the checklist yourself and fill it in for your country if anybody wants to. But I think what I would imagine is that some of the things we already saw in the democratic settings would be even stronger in a more authoritarian setting. So that those ties to the elites, and then the elites themselves exercising their own control on the media, exports of certain types of equipment, surveillance, or maybe also say content filtering and blocking of websites, control, other types of training on legislation, on modeling, on manipulating so-called guiding public opinion. I think those are some of the things that you might see happening more strongly in a more authoritarian environment, where it's really about the local government working much more closely together with the Chinese government to suppress local media and to suppress information and act on behalf of Beijing. And then certain other tactics, like the Chinese embassy calling about a critical article or a disinformation campaign, they may not need to use those. So you might see less of that in certain types of settings. I think just in general in Latin America, there is a tremendous amount of content being produced in Spanish by Chinese state media and diplomats. And I think what you see in Latin America and in generally globally, there's definitely kind of a generational element when you look at the influence. So those countries that have the highest levels of influence are often countries where there's just a longer term relationship of integration and trade and influence. And then you kind of see an increase, say, in region. And so that would be Asia or parts of Europe or the United States or Australia. Then you've got, regions like Africa, where China's been there for a lot, but you still see an increasing presence as well as that pushback. Latin America is really one of the newer regions where you're seeing more trade and investment happening. And so that was actually a region where I think 5 out of the 7 countries did see an increase in influence efforts from Beijing. And particularly it was often concentrated in the more propaganda dimensions of partnerships with mainstream local media outlets to get the content out to local audiences. So I think those are just some things that we see happening in that region.
Excellent. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to do a speed round and combine some questions that we've gotten from colleagues from Radio Free Asia, as well as our I'll call him our own Arch Puddington, who is our senior emeritus. And to ask the question, and again, speed round for each of our panelists, and then Sarah, you can wrap us up, is looking at what is that most pivotal frontier on the things that you're looking at, where is China most impactful, but where are you seeing the greatest opportunity for resilience and pushback against this, this influence that's being exerted? Let me go William, Cliff, Andy, and then Sarah, you can wrap us up.
I would say the biggest opportunity for pushback and also increasing resilience is definitely like what Cliff has already mentioned in Kenya, where Taiwan has been doing really well, is the fact check operations, and these fact check operations are often independent. They don't even take like fundings from the government, and they operate based on journalistic professionalism. With people with journalism background, and at the same time, they use different channels to really share their content, to debunk a lot of the disinformation that was either circulating on social media, or even like by mainstream media, sometimes pushing certain agendas. And these fact check operations will actually come out to identify them as wrong, so that the public will actually stop being misled and stop sharing those content. And at the same time, I think it's very important for the civil society, for the government to continue to expose like any kind of like potential threats against like a acquisition of media companies, because in Taiwan there have been some attempts by in fact Chinese money, but then like I think kind of like disguised as like companies in Hong Kong or Singapore to try to acquire media companies in Taiwan. But then because of the government's very thorough investigation into the background, they were able to actually identify it. And there were also examples of how some tragic events happen abroad, causing like the suicide of Taiwanese officials abroad, but then the government was able to actually identify where the original information came from after the whole incident happened. So I think the follow-up investigation by the government is also very important. So I think combining all these efforts together, and including like on top of that transparency, that is going to actually become a very important tool for democracies to try to push back and resist against these Chinese attempts.
Excellent. Thank you, William. All right. In our remaining 2 minutes, Cliff and then Andy, opportunities for resilience.
Yeah, so I think I agree with William that fact checking is key. It has worked well for us. But then I think fact checking is not enough, because you need some level of awareness to actually do fact checking. So to support fact checking, I think we need a lot of awareness, not just limited to the journalists, but even to the public and the audiences. I think they need to understand and acknowledge that not all content is true and factual. So in this age of disinformation, I think audiences should be taught to endeavor to fact check and to just sift through information, consider the source of information, their interests, and their agenda in the country. And I think that will go a long way to just safeguard against some of the challenges that we have with disinformation, particularly coming from foreign media companies. Yeah,
Excellent.
thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy.
Time is very short, so I want to say that Sarah's PowerPoints showed that it depends a lot country by country by country, and she has so many suggestions depending on what the problem is. So if I could take my 30 seconds to sort of twist the question around, in the case of the United States in particular, I think all of this is wrapped up in what's an alarming polarization of relations between the two countries. And so not answering her question, but really saying something else, I think our media and academia should try to maintain a kind of a cool head and not get into a slugging match with Chinese propaganda, but try to be objective so that we don't sort of push each other, US and China, into a war that could happen that we don't want. There's a very good article in the Current Foreign Affairs by Jessica Chun Weiss, who makes the point that I'm making now.
Excellent. Excellent. I am certain we could have this conversation for at least I was going to say 3 hours, but probably 3 more days or 3 more weeks, because there's so much in this report to unpack, and there's so much great research and experience from each of our panelists. Let me just stop in the interest of respecting our panelists' time to say thank you, Andy, Cliff, William. Thank you for being extraordinary panelists, for the work that you're doing outside of your time with us. Thank you to Sarah Cook and her team for an extraordinary report. Thank you to everyone who has come and spent their time with us. Looking forward to you all sharing this with your networks and sharing it with others as you go out and recognize that we have a huge opportunity to speak about this real threat that we're seeing around the world, but also the opportunities and the responsibilities for building on the resilience that we've seen in many countries. So thank you to everyone, and we look forward to being in continued conversation about this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.